And here we go.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. This is episode number 279 of the Limgumman Podcast. I am Big Bad Bob, otherwise known as Rob Clark. And along with me today is my co host, Joey Scars Borelli. And we are very pleased to have a special guest. I am so excited for this show. His name is John Limbach, and he's wrote a book entitled Where Was Skip, which you can find in our description links where you can buy the book. I'm sure it's on Amazon and probably a couple other places. And that's what we're going to talk to him about today. So, John, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Thanks, Rob, Triple B, and Joe B. It's great to be with you guys. I was so stoked when I got you. You tracked me down through my LinkedIn profile.
I did.
And said, "Hey, do you want to come on our show?" And I was really excited. I actually shared with you, Rob, or maybe on Friday over the weekend, that I've actually watched some of your stuff just to learn more about Jerry Hemming and Harold Weisberg and those things. So you were like, "Hey, I do this podcast," and I'm like, "Yeah, I know exactly. I don't know you guys, but I know your podcast." And I'm also excited to be meeting you guys because I think I'm going to learn a lot today as well too. So much of what I was trying to do originally with this book was about the DB Cooper hijacking, and then because of meeting a gentleman we'll talk about called John Papis and Loran Hall's potential involvement, and I believe his involvement in the Kennedy assassination, that it just took me on a crazy journey. And this is part of it. I'm going with the flow and I'm really enjoying it. And, publishing a book for the first time, working with Kindle and ebooks and Amazon. So it's just been a tidal wave, and I'm really excited to be here. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, dude, it's our pleasure. Totally. Yeah, I saw this correlation. So, one of my listeners sent it to me and they were like, kind of in a joking manner. They're like, "Can you believe this? Look what somebody's saying. It's Skip Hall with DB Cooper." And the more I looked at that, and I followed the description to Amazon, and I read a little bit more about it, and I was like, you know what? When you read and listen to the descriptions of DB Cooper and his mannerisms, his physical description, the more I thought in my head, you know what? This might not be too far off. You know what I'm saying? And so I was like, man, I got to talk to this guy. So we're going to have him on the show. So, John, just let everybody know kind of what got you interested in the DB Cooper case or the Kennedy assassination, or what piqued your interest first?
Mm-hmm. And maybe, sir, before, give a little 30,000 feet overview on the DB Cooper case for people that might not be aware, because
Sure.
like I said, this is a JFK like Rob said, JFK podcast. Not everyone might be aware of this story. Coincidentally, Rob, 2 years ago, before we started on our research journey that eventually led us to presenting at Lancer, he goes, "You got to check out this DB Cooper story, mystery." And I got really interested in it and watched like probably a dozen documentaries, maybe more. And so,
Yeah. I grew up as a little kid. I wasn't born yet when Kennedy was assassinated, but I grew up with this time life kind of retrospective of the assassination. So it had pictures of the newspaper covers from Dallas that said "President assassinated." And I'm an older guy. We didn't have internet. We didn't have anything. You had magazines and books and you read them over and over again. And I would sit and just page through that thing and see the little picture of John saluting and playing under JFK's desk. So I grew up with it. My mom met John Kennedy in Racine, Wisconsin, when he was campaigning through Wisconsin. And he went up to the line, shook her hand. He said, "What do you do for a living?" She said, "I'm a school teacher." And he said, "I wish I had school teachers that looked like you when I was a kid." I said that to my mom. So she still tells that story. She's 84 years old now. And, so I grew up with it, obviously, with Kennedy, but then didn't really focus on the Kennedy assassination. Like every kid, you grow up reading your school textbooks that say a lone gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald shot John Kennedy and a crazy guy named Jack Ruby killed him. Wrap that page and move on to the next page.
End of story. Right? Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to me, the paradox of kids going through school. And I guess I'm old. I still say textbooks. I know my college kids have to buy textbooks, but You look at Gallup doing that survey in November for the 60th anniversary, and only 29% of adult Americans surveyed, because they do that survey every year, believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Yet the history books still say Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and Jack Ruby was this guy that killed him. So it's really interesting. I know you guys have committed over 10 years now to doing this podcast and working on this, that, I did feel as I got more involved, this book morphed into half being about the Kennedy assassination, that if I was going to do anything to make a contribution, it would be to want to correct the historical record, or at least give the evidence that I was able to put together and dig up about Loran Hall being potentially involved in the Kennedy assassination, now bringing the voice of the youngest child of his second wife, who was 19 years old at the time of the Kennedy assassination. What I learned from him about Hall's alibi that day, what I then researched going into Harold Weisberg's personal letters with an investigator that he had looking into Hall in Kernville, California, and how when you juxtapose Hall's alibi with people like Roy Payne, Dick Hathcock, and Jerry Hemming, who say he was in Dallas, or Lester Loeb told, Jerry Hemming that he was in Dallas, that I have a chapter in this book called Bye Bye JFK Alibi, because I earlier in the book referred to Don McLean's song, Bye Bye Miss American Pie. And in the chapter of this book, I literally in outline format go through each point of Hall's alibi for the day of the assassination with factual evidence that contradicts it. And then I look at those that actually testified to the HSCA, who did affidavits, interviews with the FBI that put Hall in Dallas. I don't know how you can read that chapter and conclude anything else and then have John Papis, who was this 19-year-old boy at the time, say, I know where I was, I know where my brother was, I know where my mom was, and Skip Hall was not in California that day. And he tells me that directly, and I'm able to add that to this outline to paint a picture of whether or not Skip Hall was involved directly in the killing of the president. I'm 100% confident that he was in Dallas, Texas that day. So anyways, to get back to your question, Joe, I apologize if I'm rambling. You guys cut me off and let me know.
No, you're good.
No, you're good.
As far as Cooper, I got back into it. I grew up loving Star Trek and Dr. Spock. And when Dr. Spock does another show called In Search of and tells you about this D.B. Cooper guy that hijacked a plane, it's Mr. Spock telling you. And he's logical, right? And he's not going to lie to you, so he's going to tell you exactly what happened. And I remember watching that. I was 5 years old when D.B. Cooper on November 24th, Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, hijacked Northwest Orient Flight 305. So to answer your question, Joe, just to give the 30,000 foot view, and it's actually the 15,000 or 10,000 foot view, because Cooper instructed the pilots to fly at an altitude so that there wouldn't be the pressurization issues if you jumped out of the airplane. But at about 2:00 in the afternoon on November 21st, November 24th, 1971, a man walked into PDX, Portland International Airport, went up to the ticket counter. And for those of you that might not be as old as me, back in the day, that's like going into a bus station today or going into a movie theater to buy a ticket. You didn't have to show ID. You didn't have to walk through any metal detectors. You just basically walked up to the counter and said, hey, I want to get a ticket to Seattle. The price of his ticket was $20. He pulled out a $20 bill, paid $20. The man at the counter asked him what his name was. He said, Dan Cooper. The man wrote Dan Cooper on the ticket, handed it to him. He went and waited at the terminal. When Flight 305 was ready to take off, passengers actually went downstairs and walked out onto the concrete tarmac, because that's how you got into planes back then before we all had these jetways that we walked onto. And the back of the plane actually had stairs on the 727, which if you think about it, if you were going to plan to jump out of an airplane, you don't want to jump out of the side door and potentially get sucked into the engine. So there was a purpose to picking a 727 as the airplane for this hijacking, that if your intent was to jump out of it, you actually had rear stairs. And as you would exit the aircraft, you would be behind the plane below the engines and have a free fall. Triple B, as you probably know, 727s were used in Laos without people knowing it by Air America. And and other covert things. And obviously there were other airplanes that had rear stairs made here in the United States and overseas. But as far as commercial aircraft, it was a very rare thing back in the 70s to have a rear stair. So at about 3 o'clock, this man wants to be the last one to walk onto the airplane for what we now know obvious reasons. He's described as being about 5'10" to 6 feet tall, black hair, wearing a black trench coat, suit, a thin black tie, carrying an attaché case and a small bag. He sits in the last row, the middle row on the right side, and a young college kid comes running on to get on the plane. Probably not, to Dan Cooper's probably dismay, and he's the last one to get on and sits in the row right across from him. His name is Bill Mitchell, and I've met Bill. But so this college kid's going home for Thanksgiving weekend. He sprawls his homework out. He's doing homework on the plane. The plane is taxiing. The flight attendant in the rear of the plane, her name is Loran Schaffner. She says, "Would you like something to drink?" He orders a bourbon and 7. She brings him his drink. He spills it, so we don't know if he did that on purpose to not drink it or actually spilled it. And then as the plane is about to take off, he hands her a note. Now, it was not uncommon back in the day because the women who worked as flight attendants, and back then called stewardesses, had to look a certain way, they had to dress a certain way, they had to sign contracts on how they appeared, what their weight was. And they were purposely meant to be attractive to male passengers, to try to make airfare something even more attractive for a man to want to take a flight from Portland to Seattle than potentially drive. She thought he was hitting on her, so she took the note, put it in her pocket, and went back to sit down. He turned back to her and said, "Miss, I need you to read that note." She pulls the note out, looks at it, and says, "Miss, I have a bomb. I want you to come sit with me." So she says to him, "Is this real?" He nods yes. She comes and sits next to him. He has the briefcase now sitting closest to the window. In row 18, there was no window, which we think is another thing that he wanted to have so that no one from the outside could potentially see him. He opens it up to display a bomb. Now, we don't know if it's real. We don't know if it's fake, but it had what appeared to be 8 dynamite sticks with red tape, a large D-cell cylindrical battery, kind of like the size of a bottle of water or a taller can of beer or soda, 9-volt. And he was holding a wire and said, "If I actually touch this wire here, the plane's going to blow up." So he tells her his demands and she writes them down. He wants 2 front and 2 back parachutes. He wants $200,000 delivered. He wants it there by the time they land in Seattle. And he will release the passengers if he gets that information, if he gets that. So she calls the middle flight attendant. There were 3 flight attendants on the flight. They kind of did the business section, the middle of the plane, and then the back of the plane. Loran Schaffner was in the back, Tina Muckle in the middle, Alice Hancock in the front. She calls Tina back, and Tina ends up kind of being more known for the D.B. Cooper case because she spent the most time in this 5 hours that D.B. Cooper lived. Florence goes up to the cockpit with the note, and Florence is kind of shaken up, and they actually make her stay there. So Tina is this very, very young woman who ends up spending the most time with Cooper. She likes his cigarettes for him. She takes future demands to the front or calls them up. They negotiate where they're going to later, but the plane takes off. They're in the air. The pilots let the passengers know that they have a slight mechanical difficulty, saying that they need to burn off fuel, but this gives the FBI time to get parachutes from McCord Air Force Base in Tacoma and the money from CTAC or C First Bank, and they bring it to PDX. It's brought on the plane. The passengers are allowed to deplane. They didn't talk about where they're going. Cooper says he wants to go to Mexico City or someplace in Mexico. They get back to him and say, based on and he gives demands. He wants the plane to fly with the flaps at 15 degrees, not to go over 10,000 feet. He knows fueling procedures, certain things about the flight. And he wants the stairs deployed, the rear stairs deployed at the time of the flight. They tell him they're not going to do it. He says it can be done, but okay. And They then let him know that because they're going to be flying what they call dirty, that they wouldn't be able to get all the way to Mexico. So they're going to have to stop at least once, maybe twice to refuel. They agree on Reno. He says, fine. And then he says, let's get the show on the road. They take off. They are flying on a path called Victor 23 from Seattle Tacoma International Airport to Reno.
Yep. After they gave him the money. Right.
Right. After they gave him the money and the parachutes. That's correct. And somewhere it's believed just north of about 10 miles north of Portland in Vancouver, Washington, the pilots felt oscillation and a pressure bump. And that's where they believe Dan Cooper, this DB Cooper, actually jumped out of the back of the airplane and was never found again. So this Dan Cooper only lived for about 5 hours in the world. Nobody knows who he was before then. Nobody knows who he was after then. And they did testing with the same plane. They took it over the ocean and deployed things out of the back of the stairs and saw that the stairs actually, if you take the weight off of it, kind of slam back up or bump back up and give that oscillation pressure jump. And that's what made them believe that he first jumped at a place called Ariel, Washington, around that area. The FBI then later changed that to believe that it was this Battleground Orchards area, which again is about 10 miles north of Portland. And DB Cooper was never heard from or seen ever again for that. There was a criminal that who was called D.A. Cooper. And when the FBI started looking for if there was someone named Cooper, they looked into this D.A. Cooper, found out he was in Bend, Oregon at the time, had nothing to do with it. And that's how the name metastasized from Dan Cooper to DB Cooper, and it stuck. So he's been called DB Cooper ever since then, even though he gave his name as Dan Cooper on the plane. And again, never been found from. 10 years went by, and then in this crazy set of circumstances, a little kid named Brian Ingram, who's 9 years old, is on the Columbia River on the border of Oregon and the state of Washington, a place called Tina Bar in Vancouver, Washington, and they're going to dig a fire pit, and he's digging, and he starts finding these moldy, degraded $20 bills, and it's about $5,800, and it turns out that the serial numbers match the DB Cooper money, and of course, it changes what the heck happened that you had this one bundle of all these bundles of $20 bills that ends up buried in the sand on the shore of the Columbia River in Washington 10 years later. And everybody got really excited then, thinking we're going to solve it. Similar to the Kennedy assassination, another 5 decades go by, and nobody still knows who the heck DB Cooper was.
Yeah. And just to show everybody a little bit of these are some of the official composite sketches that were made. And I know these represent several different ones throughout time. Some little small details were changed here and there. There was, there's 5 different ones. Some are in colorized.
So just to give you real quickly, that first one called number 1 was just off of witness reports and not the sketch artist actually working with any of the witnesses. So it really was a template that was used so that when the sketch artists actually started working with the flight attendants and the witnesses, they could do number 2. And then when number 2 came out, they called that the Bing Crosby sketch. The feedback that they got afterwards was he looks too young. The consensus was Cooper was definitely probably in his 40s and may have even been 50. And that's when they did sketch 3, sketch 4, and sketch 5 after that.
Yeah, sketch 5. It's like he's at 80 years old or something in that one. I don't think that guy's
right. Sketch 5 was what would he look like today back when?
Oh, okay.
Back
I got
in, like 2010. So yeah, that was taking what they call the Cary Grant sketch and aging it, saying that if he was still alive, he might look like this today.
Mm-hmm. And one of DB Cooper's, if you want to say mistakes, was not specifying how he wanted the money in denominations, which is why they gave him marked bills, correct, of all 20s, which made it heavier and might have changed the the dynamics of his jump, because he would have had to strap this big bag of money onto him.
Right. 22 pounds of money, basically, of $20 bills bundled together.
Right.
One of the weird things about Cooper too is he requested them in a knapsack, and they came in a Seattle first canvas bag, like a Looney Tunes money bag, like that we see in the cartoons. And Tina Mucklow says he was upset about that, but he just went, instead of saying "get me a darn knapsack," and I'm sure he would have used foul language, but he started to be like, well, I'm MacGyver, so I'm just going to start cutting the shroud lines out of this one reserve chute and start using shroud lines. And that's what he did. So, he's kind of MacGyvering the situation. But we believe, the people in the Cooper community believe, he just really tied that bag up, tied, shroud lines. He cut, hundreds of feet of shroud line, and then tied it around. The other thing that he was upset about is when he got the NB6 parachutes, which were military grade parachutes, which is another thing that most people that skydive want to bring their own gear. A lot of the copycat hijackers brought their own gear. They're like, wow, how would you trust that, a parachute you're going to ask to be brought to the airport is going to be packed correctly and rigged to, your specifications that you would normally do. But Joe, to your point, they didn't have D-rings on them, and D-rings are what you would have attached the reserve chute. So when you put the back chute on, you go to put your reserve chute. So if the back chute doesn't open, you can clip that on. So he was upset about there weren't any D-rings as well too. So he couldn't even tie the shroud lines with the Looney Tunes bag of money through D-rings. So, however he did that, whether it was a mistake or not, Joe, you're right. Like, we don't know if it was a mistake. We know that when money was given to guys in Alpha 66 and JM Wave and all the stuff that was going down, they were big bags of $20 bills. Back then, hundreds weren't that known. So Cooper could have just said, I pretty much know they're going to be $20 bills, or if this was some conspiracy, they were going to be $20 bills. But you're actually right. He did not say, hey, I want these in 100 so that it weighs, 8 pounds instead of 22 pounds, and didn't make them give him a knapsack or get D-rings or anything like that. So it's kind of one of those things where, man, was this guy so skilled he just could have handled anything they threw at him? Or was he really kind of just a really inconsistent person, and that he didn't mandate that they get it right when they brought the stuff on the plane to him?
Well, in addition to having to deal with the money bag, the parachutes, he also jumped with a bomb, or alleged bomb. He did not leave that on the plane, did he?
No, he did not leave it on the plane. There's a thought that he just discarded it out the back once the stairs were deployed. And if he did, it could be never been found. And there's not a lot of people out looking in the woods with metal detectors back then. So, but for him to take the money and the briefcase, Triple B, most people believe that he just tossed that out and didn't actually try to carry the case and the money bag with him both. But again, we have no idea. We don't know if those were flares. We don't know if those were flares instead of dynamite sticks, and he could have been dropping them to get wind, signatures and things as he, where he was going to jump. Nobody knows. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
There were 2 jets circling the plane, were there not? But their speed was too. They couldn't go as slow as the speed that DB Cooper requested, so they had to circle. So the theory is that he planned his jump, or on that encircling, and obviously the pilots knew the drop of cabin pressure indicated that the lower ramp was lowered, and then he disappeared. So the money finding with those tracked bills, $20 bills, in the sand, and I believe they were doing some type of reconstruction of a dam or digging something up on the, or was it, they did that later, but found nothing more. Found nothing more, right?
Yeah. So that what's called Tina Bar is actually on the property of Fazio, the Fazio Brothers Sand and Gravel Company. So think of like a quarry where you would have mounds of sand and things like that. there also was, based on the level of the water, public and private land. So people could go on the few feet of Tina Bar's beach, and the Fazios would regrade that. The Fazio brothers also helped to ensure the success of Vancouver Lake, which is right near that property that flows into just south of their property. And so they did regrading of that area. They would put sand on that beach and, not comb it, but flatten it out. And who knows, based on from 1971 to the time that money found in 1980, how the heck it got there. I mean, for most people, Occam's razor would be, well, it washed up there. Then we had people do what's called diatom testing on it. And the only diatoms that were found on it were from springtime water and not what's called winter water. So if it would have hit that water in November and washed onto the beach, you would have winter diatoms, and they're not on there. So, I mean, the science that people have done on this is quite extensive, but nobody knows. Nobody knows if some people believe he no-pulled and splatted somewhere and the money ended up there. Some people believe he got wrapped up in a chute. Some people believe he may have landed in, water somehow, and the money got there that way and he didn't survive.
Do you think he brought, to your point earlier, do you think he brought his own chute despite requesting for? No,
I do not. He had a bag with him, but it was probably the size of a small grocery bag. So certainly not big enough to have his own gear to strap over his shoulders and do that. He may have had goggles. I mean, he had sunglasses and large sunglasses. He was supposedly wearing like loafers. And, if you're jumping out, you're going to use a 24 to 28 foot military parachute. You kind of want to have Corcoran boots or something that if you're going to land, you're not going to blow your ankles or your knees out. But we don't know if he had those type of boots where, the top is floppy, the letter's floppy, so it could just flop over and you could put them in the bottom of a small bag. And, did he have gloves in there as well too? One of the misnomers is that the weather was this stormy night. And while the weather wasn't great and it was overcast and cloudy and there was some gusting of wind, it was more light rain. And it wasn't like, I think people think, DB Cooper jumped out into, a hurricane into the Yukon. And DB Cooper jumped out into not optimal weather conditions, but once he would get through a cloud layer, he'd be able to see the lights of Portland. And, he was more towards a residential area of about 100,000 people than up into the mountains and wooded area north of Ariel at that time as well.
Excellent. All right, so let's get into how Loran Hall enters the picture as a potential DB Cooper suspect. So back in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, we know he was in prison in Cuba with Santos Traficante and some others. He definitely had ties to people like that, some of these mafia-esque type figures, these anti-Castro Cuban raiders, or mercenaries, whatever you want to call them, that were taking it upon themselves to run raids into Cuba to try to fight against Castro. And he was part of the group at No Name Key with people like Jerry Patrick Hemming, Lawrence Howard, Felipe Vidal Santiago, another guy who was definitely in Dallas that day as well, Roy Hargraves. These are serious operators. He went on to work in Operation Chaos in the CIA in the later 60s. So where do you think Loran Hall comes into the picture, or what got it in your head that he could possibly be a DB Cooper suspect?
So the one thing about Cooper that I really kind of clamped onto was Larry Carr's kind of profile of him. So Larry Carr was the FBI agent that came in and handled the case of DB Cooper from 2007 to 2010. Prior to that, Larry had worked on bank robberies. It was very successful working with people to solve bank robberies. And one of the way he did it was to get information out to the community to ask them. And I think the prior people that had the Cooper case were very close to the vest, weren't going out there trying to get information from the community. And so, Larry's profile of Cooper, when I read it, was, that he'd probably served in the military but wasn't a parachuting expert. He probably had, some type of, something close to policing training. He was probably antisocial, arrogant guy, probably grew up blue collar or was blue collar. And so Larry goes through this whole profile, and I'm looking at potential individuals for this. I was also active in a community during the pandemic called the Forrest Fenn Treasure Hunt community, and I won't get into that with you guys tonight. But one of the things about the Forrest Fenn Treasure Hunt with his grandson was, they talked about, did Fenn use GPS, and the word Loran came up. And more has been coming out about Fenn since his 20 years in the Air Force. He was a Super Saber Society member through 328 missions in 1 year in Vietnam, got shot down twice, parachuted out. Long story short, he comes back and becomes one of the most famous art dealers in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we find out that he's associated with, John Connolly, Jackie Kennedy. He sold 100 fake Elmer DeHoore paintings as fakes with John Connolly. They doubled their money together. So, the guy who sat in front of Kennedy, and this guy's doing that. But it's also come out that he was CIA adjacent or in CIA, and more will come out of that. His family is going to be releasing more information this year. He passed away at the age of 90 at the end of 2020. But the word Loran came up. And if you're thinking about it as pre-GPS, that's long-range navigation, where you have these two giant, radio towers anywhere in the world. If you pick two of them, you can find something with up to 50 feet. And this thought was, well, did he use Loran for where his treasure chest is hidden? And obviously that didn't make sense. So I would be doing these Google searches of just different words I would throw in, and throwing in Loran, JFK, Connolly, and all of a sudden this guy comes up. So if you want to think where this book came from, it actually came from the Forrest Fenn Treasure Hunt, as crazy as that sounds. But as Mr. Fenn would say, I guess it doesn't really matter what fly I used and what rod I used to hook the fish. I started looking into Loran Eugene Hall and went all the way back to his birth in Newton, Kansas, little Newton, Kansas, under 20,000 people, 25 miles north of Wichita. And then him trying to sneak into the military. I have his card in the book from when he was 15 and couldn't get into the Army, when he was 16 and couldn't get into the Army. He finally gets in when he's 17. He's honorably discharged within a year because he has an epileptic seizure and he can't, they discharge him. So he gets into the Kansas State National Guard, starts rifle training there. And within a year, though, he's back in the Army, even though his first separation agreement says not able to serve, right? So somehow he weaseled his way back in again and goes off to Fort Knox. And the next thing you know, by end of 1949, he's in Oberammergau, Germany, where the joint U.S.-European counterintelligence training is. So he's going to school in counterintelligence. He takes provost marshal investigations training. He becomes a military police officer. He does plainclothes work to stop smuggling and contraband on the border after the war. He meets his first wife, who's an English professional skater in the Ice Capades, and brings her back to the United States, and they end up having 4 kids. He also tells Congress, because he actually relates this, and I actually do in the book, Joe and Rob, I do in one chapter, I take the 300 pages of HSCA testimony and I narrow it down to 22 pages. So nobody has to go through and read 300 pages of it. But he actually talks about all of his service. He talks about a nervous breakdown that happens because when he gets back from Germany, he and his family moved to Omaha, Nebraska, because on the other side of the river, he serves there with the Iowa National Guard. And he gets his first taste of the casino business because west of Chicago, Omaha is the biggest illegal sports book and has the biggest casino. And Las Vegas doesn't exist yet at that time. And so he gets a taste of the casino business and really likes it. But he's gone all the time. And they move back to Newton, where his parents are. And his wife divorces him in 1958, saying she loves him, but he's gone all the time. He can't hold a steady job. And Hall then tells his parents, hey, Mom, Dad, I've got a friend in Miami. I'm going to go down there. Well, it turns out that the friend was the brother of Santo Trafficante Jr. He went down there to Miami to work in the casinos. And it's before the end of 1958, he goes over to Cuba, working at the Capri Casino for Santo Trafficante Jr.'s group, and starts to really get into what he was trained to do again. And he ends up in the mountains with Castro and Che, and he's going to be a Cuban freedom fighter because Batista has gotten so corrupt, even though the U.S. has supported Batista all this time, that, you know, Eisenhower finally in 1959 says, enough, we can't support Batista anymore. He's killed 20,000 people. He's literally just killing anybody that is trying to uncover the corruption or is against him at that time. So Hall is back in 59 in Cuba, but our friend Castro surprises them all. Hemming, Sturgis surprises all those guys and says, I really like this Khrushchev guy, and I'm going to go with him instead. And these guys are pissed, as you guys know. And Hall starts training a group of his own team to potentially go into Nicaragua to disrupt the communist uprising there. Excuse me. And Castro finds out, throws him in jail, but also they say throws him in jail. But this is where you find out that Tiscornia prison was what we would call in the United States a country club prison. And he's in what's called a Quonset hut. If you remember the barracks is, he's in a 7 to 8 man Quonset hut in this country club prison in the same Quonset hut with Santo Trafficante Jr. And they're bringing in trays of food, lasagna is being made. Trafficante has his own barrels of wine and cases of liquor there.
It almost reminds you of the scene in Goodfellas when they're in prison and they're getting all the wine and all these.
That's right, yeah.
And they have their own special wing. And ironically, I don't know how many episodes, Rob, 3 or 4, I did a little segment on Tresconia prison and who was there. And, you know, a lot of characters were there, and it explains... It can easily explain his association with Santo Trafficante Jr. And I'm sure they hit it off there, as there was not much to do except for eat and talk.
So I think the 2 biggest things that I took from that time is that Hemming actually comes there, and Hemming is still in good standing with Castro. You know, Castro made Hemming a colonel in his army as the leader of paratroop training. So Jerry Hemming actually comes to the prison there, and Hemming thought that they were scared of him at first, like he was coming there to take them out. But Hemming visited them, and then Rob, if you recall, I have it marked, but there was at the prison there, they were also with a. In fact, let me grab the window here because they were with a British journalist was there as well too, and that British journalist said that they were visited twice by a guy named Jack Ruby.
Yes,
they were both in that Quonset hut in 1959. So that's where my head starts to explode with all of this going. Oh my goodness!
And Sancho Trafficante gets out shortly after Ruby's visit.
Yeah, so they get Hall out of there right away. So Hall was only in there for about 3 months, and it was before policy changed on Cuba. So he gets back before the end, like the summer of 59. Trafficante, funny, and what I found out, was facing tax evasion charges in Miami, and also had a family member that was getting married down there. And Trafficante made the decision to hang out down there in prison a little bit longer. Because he didn't want to get back to Miami right away, when he could have, which I think is quite interesting. So he got back closer to the fall of that year, hung out a couple more months in Cuba, eating his lasagna and drinking his wine, and the Quonset hunt, going to a wedding down there. And to your point, he could have left at the same time Hall did. So yeah, that's the whole Hemming, that starts the relationship in 59, right? Which is important. Because later Hemming is trying to make it sound like he didn't even know Hall until 63. Because Hall wasn't down in No Name Key with Interpen and Alpha 66 and JM Wave. Hall was back in Wichita meeting his second wife, getting his student pilot's license because Interpen required certain things like minimum of 5 jumps and all of these things. And
That's actually
all,
what I was going to ask you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
no, you have to interrupt me sometimes, so please do.
No, no worries. We are big. We are very interested in Interpen. There's a lot of suspects in that group that we think are prime suspects. Of course, we don't claim to, know who the shooter was or who was involved or anything like that. But
Right.
Hemming and Hall did not like each other, and you have someone like John Martino who spent was it 18 months in the Cuban jail, the same one, Trisconia. So it's very interesting that Hall got out so quickly when someone like Martino, mafia related, was rigging slot machines during the Batista era, got out quickly. I mean, didn't get out quickly. Hall did, and now Traficante maybe said, maybe I'll stay here a little longer. Very interesting.
Yeah, I agree with the whole Interpen thing. To me, it's oddly timed. And the thing that struck me the most in my research that I don't know about, that I'm kind of still looking into, is Operation 40. Because before there's any operation, before there's a Bay of Pigs, before there's Northwoods, before there's Mongoose, before there's these operations, Dulles takes a plan to Eisenhower that gets approved called Operation 40. And the person who oversees it is Richard Nixon. And if you go to Wikipedia and look up the Bay of Pigs, there's pages upon pages upon pages of stuff, right? If you go look up Operation Mongoose, there's pages upon pages upon pages of stuff. If you go look up Operation Northwoods, there's pages and pages and pages. Alpha 66, pages and pages and pages. Operation 40, 2-3 paragraphs, and then you have to go down and click on stuff to find out more. Yet in those 2 paragraphs, it says that Operation 40 lasted until 1970. And the people associated with Operation 40, their names most associated are Sturgis, E. Howard Hunt. So, you look at this arc from pre-Kennedy to Watergate, and it's the same players. And it's striking to me, that when you're looking into Interpen and Operation 40, to me, there's definite connections there. Frank Fiorini is in that 1961 June syndicated article that goes throughout the country of Jerry Hemming in the Bush hat with the canopies coming down, where all these young men start sending letters to Interpen saying, hey, we want to join you and take out Castro and be anti-Cubanist. And Hemming has to put this form letter to go that's in the book. It's in an FBI report that goes out saying, thank you very much for your interest. Just so you know, we're not affiliated with the military. We're the Intercontinental Penetration Force is what Interpen stood for. And to be in Interpen, you either already have to have military special forces training, or you're going to need to go to your local jump center and do a minimum of 5 free falls. You're going to need to have your own gear, your chutes, your reserve chutes, goggles, boots. You're going to have your own transportation down here. You're going to have your own money, because we don't have any. And, this is this letter that Hemming sends out to try to keep these kids from all driving down to the Florida Keys and before, and that wouldn't be qualified to be part of Interpen. But to your point specifically, Joe, I'm very, very interested in the fact that Operation 40 lasts all the way to Watergate. And I think that there's more research that needs to be done in that area, because I think that has a lot to do with some answers on, just to take a step back, because we've never talked before. When you talk about the Kennedy assassination, people are like, there's no way like 200 people could have known about this and conspired together and whatever. I think there's chapters to it. I think there's certain things certain people knew at certain times. I also think there were very patriotic and good Americans post-assassination that tried to, for the good of the country, have it go away as quickly as possible and all those things. And so I don't think you have to have a grand conspiracy where 20 people from the mafia and 20 people from the CIA and 20 people from the government are all working together, because that is absurd. But I do think that there's this blending together of certain chapters of a book that you and I may know chapter 1 and 13 and 17, but we don't know what's going on with the other chapters of the book. And I really think that more so explains what happened with the Kennedy assassination. And I do think that, whatever was going on in with the West Covina John Birch Society, with Lawrence Howard being there, and Loran Hall, Jerry Hemming, and that group, then connected to John Martino, very tightly connected to John Martino. I mean, Hall admits that he helped plan the Bayo Pauli invasion that Martino went on. Hall admits that he was in the hotel down there in Miami with Trafficante and Johnny Roselli and all those guys, and they were talking about taking Castro out together, and he helped plan the raids. So the fact that these guys come together. Oh, one other point, and maybe you guys probably know more about this than I do. Certain parts of Interpen kept getting shut down by local law enforcement that didn't know that they were connected to JM Wave down there. So that's when they decide to say, we're going to move our operations to this place just north of Covington in New Orleans. And that's when they get connected in with Ferry and Bannister and Shaw and all those guys. So most people don't know that the majority of Interpen, besides Hemming's group, moves to Covington and is in New Orleans. And that's where Interpen is basically doing things, 1962, 1963 at that time as well, too. So yeah, very, very interesting. And I think Interpen, certainly there are multiple people, as you said, if you go to Spartacus or wherever, where they list all those guys, where you see names and you're like, fielder's choice. We don't know who, but pick one and look into them. And could they do the job? Absolutely.
Yeah, I always thought, whoever pulled the trigger that day in Dealey Plaza, it had to be either for money, which these guys qualify for, or ideology, which these guys qualify for. Because then when you start going after the Bay of Pigs, and, a lot of these guys lost family, friends, uncles, brothers, cousins, and all of them blamed Kennedy for not sending any support. And in the post Bay of Pigs, you have the formation of all these anti-Castro Cuban groups and these mercenary groups who try to take it upon themselves to take the fight to Castro. They figure, well, if Kennedy's not going to do it, somebody's got to do it. And that's a very strong ideology. I mean, to put it into perspective, it'd be like, today, if you believed in an ideology so much, it would be like me calling you guys up and saying, hey, Joe, John, man, let's get together. I got a boat. We're going to go over. We're going to fight ISIS on our own.
Yeah.
Screw it. If the government's not going to do it, we're going to do it.
Yeah.
We'll patch a boat together. I got a gun or two. We're going to go get them. I mean, that's the kind of thinking that, these guys were doing. It's crazy.
Not only thinking, but they were doing it, the actions. Yes. And to Rob's point, those are the people that I believe most likely probably pulled the trigger. The people that were so we're so
ideology so much that they would leave their family, their wives, their children, their jobs to do this. It's something that they believed in so strongly. And for me, that's the kind of person that pulled the trigger that day. I don't think money would have just been a sole motivating factor to take Kennedy out, but that's just me. But
right. I mean, I agree with that. I think they all needed money, right, to live. But one of the things about Hall that I was really surprised that never really came up between, the Warren Commission time and when he's subpoenaed by Garrison, beats that subpoena, but then goes to New Orleans and meets with him anyway, is, Loran Hall, after the Garrison stuff is done, and Garrison basically comes out and exonerates Hall and calls him a great American and for coming down there, is Loran Hall signs a deal with the National Enquirer, and Garrison is in it as well. Loran Hall's on the cover of the National Enquirer and says, I was offered $50,000 to kill JFK.
Right.
So what's really interesting is in the spring going into the summer of 1964, Loran Hall and his wife, who moved out to California from Wichita. She had a job as the executive assistant to the head of Cessna Airlines. And so they first moved to Pasadena, which is interesting because right next to Pasadena is Lockheed, who's working on, the SST and the bombers and everything. Jet Propulsion Laboratory is right there. But they moved basically out to CIA, Jerry Hemming Central out there, where Angleton lived in the same. So Angleton lived literally like in the same subdivision as Jerry Hemming's two uncles. And Hemming met Angleton 4 times. And then you have Hemming in the book. I outline where it's not just at Sugi in Japan where Hemming meets Oswald. Hemming meets Oswald in Florida. Hemming meets Oswald in New Orleans. And Hemming stands on the driveway of the Cuban consulate in Monterey Park and talks to Oswald there. So I documented at least 4 times that Hemming talks to Oswald directly. And I had to listen to all those hours of Jerry Hemming talking to Greg Burnham and A.J. Weberman, and you guys put some of that stuff on.
We've listened to that.
So I went deep, man. I went deep on Hemming, and when you start piecing everything you did together, you start to go, oh man, whether you call him a handler or not, and Hemming's meeting with Angleton 4 times, Hemmington's meeting with Oswald 4 times. I believe that really good people thought Oswald's end game was going to be to go to Cuba and take out Castro. I really do. I think David Atlee Phillips thought that. I think George de Mornenschild thought that. I think Ruth Paine thought that. I think they thought they were bringing this guy back who they had, that wasn't a real defector. He was part of a plan to be a fake defector. I mean, who defects to Russia, comes back with their Russian wife, and is set up in Dallas without either going to jail or he had one meeting. He had one meeting when he got back. And the next thing you know, he's given to de Mornenschild, who gives him to Ruth Paine. And his wife is living with Ruth Paine. And, all these things go on. So I think there was part of the CIA that truly thought Oswald was being set up as a communist sympathizer that would be brought back into Cuba somehow. And instead of failing to kill Castro with the pills that melted in someone's face cream or, these multiple assassination attempts, that they were really working to have Oswald do that. And I think Oswald got co-opted by this Interpen Operation 40 group, so that you had the group of the CIA that was his lifestyle. Where's he going to live? Who's going to introduce him to people where he's going to live? How's he going to get his job at the Texas School Book Depository that Ruth Paine gets for him? But we're doing all of this to set him up as this, person that could then go to Cuba. Well, I think they co-opted Oswald, and Oswald was brought into, if you want to call him a patsy, you can, to help take the fall for the Operation part of Operation Northwoods Operation Northwoods. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it or not, but it was this crazy plan where we'd do all these things that would make it look like Cuba attacked us so that we could take out Cuba, including flying a commercial plane as a drone with recordings of screaming people on it and shooting it down and saying Castro did it, or bombing our base down by Homestead, some of the warehouses there.
Or
one of the other things was
an airliner and blowing it up. Yeah.
One of the other parts of Northwoods was a fake assassination attempt on U.S. soil. And we would blame it on Cuba. And then, so if you look up Operation Northwoods, it's all in there. And, you had the CIA lifestyle part of him coming back, de Mornenschild, Ruth Paine, Atlee Phillips, to get him eventually to Cuba to take out Castro. He's co-opted by the John Birch mafia, these guys, the Martinos working with the Interpen guys or whatever, and becomes part of this plot to, hey, we're going to run the Operation Northwoods, Lee, and the way it's going to work is you're going to get blamed as for this failed attempt, and then we're going to get you out of the country to Cuba, and Castro's going to love you there, and then that's when you're going to take him out. So, I mean, there's all these ways you could look at it, but that's the one that makes the most sense to me in regards to how this thing got chaptered, like I said earlier, where David Atlee Phillips said, yeah, he was one of us. Oswald was, Atlee Phillips has to admit in his book towards the end of his life, yeah, obviously Oswald, was connected. But Atlee Phillips says in his book and at the end of his life, we thought he was going to do what he did to Kennedy, to Castro. And then you have John Martino, knowing he's going to die, who gives basically his deathbed confession saying, he regrets that he was involved in killing the president of the United States. And so whether
Also,
people
too,
take
John,
credit for things that they did or not, you can see how messy it is and how intertwined it is, and how Loran Hall could have easily been part of that non-lifestyle chapter of who puts him where he's supposed to be, who trains him what to do, who trains him to shoot, who trains him to be where we need him to be at the times where we need him to be. And Loran Hall can certainly fit that bill as being part of that planning.
Yeah, and to your point, the rifle found in the depository was ordered by A.J. Heidel.
Yeah, A. Heidel.
And not Lee Oswald. And, Heidel was this fictional Castro supporter who was part of the, Fair Play for Cuba committee in New Orleans. So Oswald may have figured, okay, well, maybe there's a fake assassination attempt. This rifle is going to be found in the name of this pro-Castro supporter guy, and it'll be enough to where Kennedy will be forced to do something about Cuba then. But instead, it got his alias with paper thin, and it eventually got traced back to him. But I always thought that was, if Oswald was in on the whole deal, that's what he possibly was led to believe.
Right. I think he was led to believe that they were going to,
and miss,
Right. I think he was set up to believe he was going to be part of a failed assassination attempt.
Right.
That he would be shuffled off to Cuba, where they would open him with open arms as a guy who tried to take out the president, and he would be close enough to then take out Castro. I believe I have no idea if that's the truth or not, but with all these hours and hours of research I've done and looked into things, I think it's weird that for most people that don't know, with the Tippit killing, that they found a wallet at the site of the Tippit killing. Yet Oswald had his wallet on him when he was at the theater, and the wallet they found at the Tippit killing had the A. Heidel stuff in it, so that they could put the rifle order for him together. And then all of a sudden, the whole wallet at the Tippit murder thing goes away, and you never hear about it again in the Warren Commission. So that's
on
more,
tape even.
Right. Yeah. So there's stuff in here that's like, I think years ago, like you guys probably know these people that you really admire because they put so much time. People are, when they listen to this stuff, they're like, you guys are wackos, or the people that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, Mark Lane, these people that got pilloried or whatever the word is for asking these questions about, you get documents here that say there's a wallet found at the Tippit murder scene, yet he had a wallet with him, and when he was arrested at the theater. What is going on here? And that stuff just got brushed. Anything that didn't fit the narrative for the Warren Commission, it's funny when you hear all these witnesses that we now have, like you said, Joe, on video or recordings, and they say, well, did you tell that to the Warren Commission? And they say, well, I was never called, or they never asked me. There was definite cherry picking going on who was in that report. And again, I believe that there were a lot of good Americans who thought they were doing the right thing by making this go away as quickly as possible. You've got Arlen Specter, who was told there's 3 shots, make it work. You got Johnson giving the Johnson treatment to, Earl Warren, making Earl Warren cry, saying you're going to have the lives of 40 million people that are going to die in a nuclear war when we go to World War III if you don't take on the Warren, if you don't do this commission. Even though LBJ didn't want to do the commission, once it was decided they were going to do it. I mean, so I think that there were really good Americans, patriots, people that wanted to do the right thing in Bethesda for the autopsy, wanted to do the right thing throughout the whole thing to avoid World War III and make this go away. But in a way, how can you conclude anything else than what Gallup shows every year, that only 29% of the people in our country believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone?
Yeah.
Yep. And I think that's one of the one of the main mistakes that the community makes, is that the people who covered it up for whatever reasons, mainly CYA mode, were possibly the plotters. I think they're two different, complete
different chapters of a very complicated book. Guys at Bethesda had no idea what the hell went on. They did what they were told.
Yeah.
Take these photographs away, put these photographs in, do this stuff. Why is Curtis LeMay at the autopsy? Why, what's going on that all this stuff happens. But I do believe that there was a large percentage of people that weren't part of a conspiracy. They were, number one, doing what they were told if they were in the military or the government. And the whole goal was, let's put this behind the country as quickly as possible. And you can see how that strategy, whether you agree with it or not, works well to not have the country going, was it Russia? Was it Cuba? And us potentially getting into, a maelstrom of, aggression and things that might have happened. But
it's rational. It's rational.
Yeah, it's rational.
Not wanting to get into nuclear war. And
right.
Rob and I have talked about this. I'll talk for myself, but we believe the goal of the assassination was to prompt an invasion of Cuba.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
And that did not happen.
Right.
And a lot of people were in their own, especially the different agencies, they cover their own behinds mode. And I think that gets very confusing in terms of, they might have covered up some things, but were they the plotters? Were they responsible? Do they have foreknowledge? That's very complicated and a different question.
I found this very interesting, being a business leader and looking at the financial side of the Kennedy assassination and the 4,000 books that have come out. That if you're on the side of Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy and acted alone, Gerald Posner, Luke Hogg, the ballistics guy, all these guys that get rolled out, Vincent Bugliosi before that, you can make a lot of money that way. And because that's the theme that has, like we said, it was this is what we're going with. And that how hard it's been for people like Grodin and other people that have, tried to get their words out. What Oliver Stone went through, which, we think back to 1991, you guys were little kids, but, what people have gone through to try to get the truth out, I think is amazing. And I watched, so two things happened last year that struck me. And if we want, please direct me back to Hall if you want, but two things got to me last year while I was writing this book. JFK, What the Doctors Saw, came out on Paramount Plus in November. And I don't know how any human being can watch that. First of all, it's riveting and it's emotional. And you see these doctors who are professionals, and to a man and the women that were there as well that day, to hear them talk about what they saw, and then talk about Dr. Perry and say it was they all say it was entrance wound to the throat, exit wound to the back of the head. These guys were there. They're physicians. They have no reason to lie. And I thought it was also interesting that I learned that it was filmed 13 years earlier by a British crew. Remind me of the Zapruder film not coming out till 75. Here you have this documentary that came out for the 60th anniversary that was filmed 13 years earlier, and they're all dead now. But I was struck by that. And then, of course, we had Paul Landis's book come out, The Secret Service Agent, who was very close to the Kennedy family, probably the closest Secret Service agent as far as taking care of Jackie and the kids. And he writes this book. And I'm finishing up my book right now going, what is going on here 60 years later with the Kennedy assassination that we have? The doctor stuff had been known. It just hadn't put together that well like that production was. But then you have, I can imagine if Cyril Wecht, who's obviously probably getting closer to the end of his life right now and hasn't been doing as many public appearances. But can you imagine him doing his magic bullet routine? Had Paul's book come out 10 years earlier and having him end this. I love when Cyril Wecht does the magic bullet routine. Can you imagine him then saying, then it came out of Governor Connolly's thigh and went back behind Mrs. Kennedy and the president in the back of the limousine. I mean, whether that's the same bullet or not, I mean, I just was gobsmacked that you've got an 80-year-old Secret Service agent who's very close to the Kennedys, who's coming out at the end of his life saying, I found this bullet between the back of the leather of the back seat of the limousine and the crease. And this just happened in November, right? 60 years after the assassination, we're getting these two things coming out, which I found astounding.
Yeah.
Yep, the old magic bullshit theory. I've heard it in person from Cyril Weck, so it's definitely awesome.
Yeah.
Let's get back to
the waters keep getting muddier and muddier. But yes, let's get back to Hall, sir.
Yeah, right. So let's fast forward a little bit in the timeline. So we've hit the Garrison investigation where you have Hall and Howard, and Hemming actually did a little work for Garrison, not so much as a suspect, but more as a private investigator, if you will, which is funny to me. And also he was a consultant on the movie JFK, which is funny to me. He's actually in it too.
That's the definition of irony, actually.
Yeah. The cat is in the hen house, folks. But so you have basically them getting away clean from the Garrison investigation, which of course, was around 68. It wrapped up in 69 with Clay Shaw getting off. And then we move forward a little bit. D.B. Cooper happens in November of 71.
Right.
So let's get there, John. How do we get Loran Hall to Washington or Oregon in that time frame? And that's my question. How do we get Skip Hall there and his associations with that stuff?
Right. So Skip and starting just a couple years before Garrison, Skip and his wife get this hotel in Kernville with a 5-bedroom home for $48,000 5 months after the Kennedy assassination, when he says he was offered $50,000 to kill the president. But that hotel on early December 1966, the Kern River in California has one of the worst epic floods of all time. And their little motel was right on the bank of the Kern River, and it gets washed away. Their house gets washed away. Over 100 RVs get washed away. The Kern River Bridge goes out. If you wanted to get from one side to the other, you had to drive 20 miles. The person that comes to the rescue to set the charges to blow up the debris and the old bridge, Loran Eugene Hall. They let him set the charges on the bridge. So when we talk about demolitions experience and bomb making experience, there you go.
After this, boys.
Yeah, I got it, boys. I'll climb out. I'll set the charges.
Just step back.
Right. And so we get, post Garrison, right? So interestingly enough, one item that was left on the Flight 305 plane is a black clip-on tie with a white clasp that would go over, because they used to have just like regular metal colored clasps. And that's the photo that Rob has there, where we actually zoomed in and did some clarification of that. And that actually is a clip-on tie. And that's 1968. Members of the Cooper community looking into Cooper's tie that the FBI has. That model, patent number, everything came out at the end of 1964 through 65. So whether that tie that's being worn in that picture right there to talk to Jim Garrison was left on Flight 305 would be insane, right? If that would ever actually. Sorry, Rob, you're muted.
Sorry. At least we have a picture of Loran Hall in a black suit with a white shirt and a black tie on.
Yeah,
we know he at least wore the suit. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So now to get to your
like the type of guy that didn't wear suits, but
So
when they did,
when they went to J.C. Penney to ask about that tie, they gave them the make and the model number, and they said this is the favorite tie of people in the service industry: busboys, waiters, bartenders. Well, after the motel went away, guess what Loran Hall did? He was a bartender in Wolford Heights, which is just south of Kernville on Lake Isabella, at a place called Duffy's, and he leaves Duffy's to go to New Orleans to talk to Jim Garrison, where he's a bartender. So that very well could have been a the tie that he wore while he was bartending there. He leaves the Garrison investigation, gets the money from the National Enquirer. I don't know how much he was paid for that front page story, but dude has to be on cloud nine. Jim Garrison has basically exonerated him. He's in the National Enquirer in every supermarket in the United States in 1969, with them blasting out that he was not involved and he believes it was right-wing people associated with Lester Logue and H.L. Hunt's. And he's done, man. He's cleared the whole Kennedy stuff, right? He doesn't have to worry about it anymore. Mm-hmm. But he's also doesn't have Jerry Hemming on his side anymore, because they did have a falling out, or at least publicly they had a falling out, but I believe they did. He's kind of on his own for doing covert stuff or whatever he was going to be doing. And there's some people that believe he got involved with amphetamine sales, because Nixon would sign the drug law to make that a class 2 narcotic. So was he selling that? They had a little airstrip right next to Lake Isabella in Kernville, where if he wanted to fly and he had a pilot's license, he and or his wife could fly there and fly back to Burbank into the Los Angeles area. But I don't know, Rob. This is where people in the Cooper community that deal with other suspects like Ted Braid and others who we know were spooks are like, you literally can't find anything on Loran Eugene Hall. Nothing, 1970, 71. He's a ghost. He's literally a ghost. So we don't know what he's doing during that time frame, but we do know a couple things. We do know that on his first separation from the U.S. Army, his separation took place at Fort Lewis, Washington, which became Joint Fort Lewis McChord Air Force Base, where the parachutes came from for the D.B. Cooper hijacking. So he knew Tacoma. That's important because his Flight 305 was getting ready to land in Seattle and was circling Puget Sound and SeaTac Airport. Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant, was having a conversation with Cooper, and unsolicited, Cooper said, she said, oh, they're getting the parachutes from the Air Force Base. And Cooper said to her, well, McChord, if they speed, is only 20 minutes away. So that led Mucklow to believe that Cooper had knowledge of McChord Air Force Base. Also, as they were circling around, Cooper looked out the window and said, we're over Tacoma now. And there had been no announcement from the pilots. So she also reported that as he must have known what it looked like to be flying over Tacoma and Puget Sound. So the fact that Hall had been at the Air Force Base there is one important piece of evidence, Rob. The other is that his only sibling, and what's interesting is John Papis, who was that young 19-year-old boy that took this Carcano rifle that we'll talk about from Hall right after the assassination. But he had John Papis. His mom was married to Hall from 1960 to 1975. John had no idea that Hall had a sibling, his sister Joanne, who was 3 years younger than him, also born in Newton, lived in the Newton, Wichita area, was married, had 3 boys, then got divorced and married a Mormon man who lived in Snohomish County, which is a county of Seattle, Washington, and that this man had left his wife for Hall's sister probably sometime in 1969 or 1970. And certainly they were together in the suburbs of Seattle at the time of the hijacking in 1971. So Hall actually had his only living sibling lived in that area as well too. So, and then the one other thing, Rob, and I don't know if you guys it's called the Lake Elsinore incident or the Elsinore ghost. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story or not, but this ties back into the Kennedy assassination, and this is crazy stuff. But in 1971, the first week of December, a week after the Cooper hijacking, a man named Lyle Cameron, who runs the Elsinore Jump Center in Lake Elsinore, California, calls the FBI, and the FBI writes a 302 report where Lyle Cameron says a man fitting the description of D.B. Cooper came into the Elsinore Jump Center. He was wearing Corcoran boots. He had Raleigh cigarette coupons, and he was asking questions about how one would jump out of a commercial airliner and what the settings would be, and also asking if Cameron knew of any jump centers in the Pacific Northwest.
I wonder if that's a Raleigh right there.
Right. So Here's what's really weird. If you go to the Black Vault and look up Lyle Cameron, you just go to Black Vault Lyle Cameron and look it up. Cameron was this crazy great jumper, and he actually was the president of the U.S. skydiving team, 69 and 70. He took over for the guys from Paraventures who were running the Jump Center before he did. The guys who ran the Jump Center before he did in Elsinore were on the TV show called Ripcord from 1960 to 1962. And Cameron actually jumped on the show Ripcord as well, too, which was filmed in the Los Angeles area and filmed at Lake Elsinore at the Elsinore Jump Center. The thing about Cameron, when you go into his 302s in the Black Vault, and if you guys don't know this, it's going to blow your mind. The day before Lee Harvey Oswald is killed, there are phone records between Lyle Cameron and Jack Ruby. You can read it right in the 302s on the Black Vault on Lyle Cameron.
Wow. That's crazy.
And
I did not
a lot
know
of people forget that Ruby ended up working in the 50s for Congressman Nixon back then and was out in California. So, you know, after his Chicago, Detroit days and before Dallas, Ruby actually worked for Richard Nixon out in California. But how Ruby would be connected to Lyle Cameron and have a phone record of a call taking place the day before that, and then Cameron to be involved in the D.B. Cooper case. And then I found a tape where Hemming's talking to, I think it's Weberman, might have been Burnham, but he's talking to Weberman, and he talks about, well, you know, the CIA trained guys at Elsinore, and I had access to all the jump cards there, and that's where Hemming finds the card of the guy who jumps that works for the Los Angeles Times to take him back to Miami with him, because Hemming didn't want to pay for the trip. So Hemming gets the LA Times to pay for this reporter and him to go back to Miami and do stories on Interpen, which are the stories that all those letters come in from the kids. So Hemming had access to all the jump cards at Elsinore. John Papis, this 19-year-old kid that Hall handed a Carcano rifle to, who's a pilot who I think I told you guys about, he jumped at the Elsinore Jump Center too. He said, I landed hard on my heel once and my knee blew up like a grapefruit. But he said, I don't ever remember talking to Skip about parachutes or jumping. We just shot guns. Skip made machine guns. You know, they would convert machine guns that were filled in with lead at the end, take the old barrels off, put the new ones on, take them to the San Gabriel gun range, sell them at the El Monte shop, or put them in the van or the U-Haul and take them back to Miami for the Cuban freedom fighters. And John Papis said, I used to load thousands of rounds for Skip and put them in the back of his trucks. And of course, we know Hall got arrested in September by the Coast Guard in Miami. Didn't go to jail. Somehow they all got to go free. Just really, really interesting, the connection between Lyle Cameron making this report to the FBI the week after, saying this guy comes in Corcoran boots asking questions about how to jump, and the same Lyle Cameron has phone records talking to Jack Ruby the day before Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby. Now that's crazy, guys. I mean, it's wild stuff. So anyway, to your point of what Skip Hall was doing in 1971, I don't know, Triple B. I mean, he's a ghost. He's a ghost. You have Richard Nixon as the president now. Richard Nixon, who has Operation 40 that Frank Sturgis is a member of, E. Howard Hunt is, back in 1959. And these are the guys associated with the Watergate burglary after the D.B. Cooper. And a man named Najib Halabi, who was the head of the FAA, and then the president and chairman of Pan American Airlines, was in the White House meeting with Nixon. And when that meeting ended, 3 hours later, D.B. Cooper hijacked a plane in Portland, Oregon. When Halabi was head of the FAA, there's a video. If you just do Najib hijack on YouTube, there's a 2-minute video where he talks about, as the president of Pan Am, how hard it would be to stop a hijacker or a hijacking. And the pilots union is going crazy. So the pilots union is going back to the federal government saying, you guys need to do something, because we're sick and tired of all these hijackings. I mean, hijackings exploded in the late 1960s into the early 1970s. And most of it was take us to Cuba, right? And so people involved in hijacking, if Hall was involved in some way as Cooper, there would have been a lot of talk of hijacking during his time together with his friends. There would have been talk about jumping out of the back of parachute planes, which Hemming even mentioned, requesting from Interpen with Janwave that they would have planes with rear stairs so they could drop their cargo and jump out of the back and do it more successfully. But there are people that believe D.B. Cooper was part of a federal government plan to not have to go through dealing with individual states, individual airlines, and to just federalize it for aviation safety to stop hijackings. And that potentially this Cooper case, you know, like you said, Joe, ask for the money. Who cares? You're not going to keep the money anyways because it's just part of a government thing to have a guy jump out of a plane. All right, Najib. All right, Dick Nixon. All right, hey, Sturgis, who should we get to do it? Well, Hall lives out there. See if he'll do it. You know, it's do I believe
or
in
Hall's
a big
crazy enough to do
conspiracy
this?
from DB Cooper?
Call Skip.
Yeah. Do I believe in a big conspiracy from DB Cooper? I don't know. The only thing I know is nobody ever found a body. Nobody ever found a parachute. So if he died, you know, it floated out the Columbia River out into the ocean. Nobody ever found any money other than those bills. Now, there's a belief that because the tracking of the bills might not have been as great as it is today, that those bills, you know, after a couple weeks or months, people would stop checking. But there were about 300 star notes in those 1963 and 1969 $20 bills. And those are highly collectible. Yeah. So, you know, the fact that not one of those star notes ever turned up is quite interesting. But boy,
I think it represents some type of error or on the bill, right? Or the star note?
I don't. That's a good question.
I believe it does. I used to be a coin collector years ago, but to your point, in 1971, when this occurred, there was no. You did not have to provide your ID. There was no security check. There were no checks for weapons or ID, or you know, or anything. So, was this possibly an operation to enact those type of checks?
And if you know this thing's coming down the pipe, you might want to invest in a metal detecting company, X-ray scanner companies.
Well, and guess who got to make a heck of a lot of money off that? Najib Halabi. His daughter ended up marrying King Hussein of Jordan, and he worked with the Saudis for a long time. So he was already a really wealthy guy. But very interesting that Hall, of all people, could, if he is a suspect for this, he's almost one of the guys where it would make the most sense. Because the operation, he was part of the operation. If he's part of my belief that Operation 40 was this thing that stretched all the way into the early 70s with Sturgis and Hemming and those guys, he's out there. He could go to the Elsinore Jump Center. He may have never jumped there before. Obviously, he hadn't met Lyle Cameron. And who is somebody that Hall asked, well, is there anybody I could go talk to out here about how to jump out of a 727? And they'd be like, yeah, go talk to Lyle. All right. You know, he never met him, but so Cameron says he came in wearing Corcoran boots, looking kind of geeky. Well, Hall, if you see the video of him on killing Oswald, you know, Hall could look really different. I mean, he could look like Errol Flynn, you know, the first guy that played Robin Hood, and then he could look like this complete schlub. And it's really interesting to see the dynamics of how he could change his appearance, obviously take off his facial hair if he needed to. And how, when I was on a show on Tuesday night with the DB Cooper community, Ryan Burns, who's a leader of that community now, he's a Cambridge educated attorney. He was worked for the government. Now he's a criminal defense attorney. And Ryan said Hall is really one of the only suspects that meets the full criteria of the physical appearance of having ruddy, olive-complected dark skin who could pass for Cuban, because we know that Hall went around making money as Lorenzo Pasillo. He goes to Cuba in 1958 and says, hey, what will my name be in Spanish? And they say, well, Hallway is Pasillo and Lorenzo, so you're Lorenzo Pasillo. And that's how he got the name. But he literally in 1963 is going to American Legion halls. He's going to Knott's Berry Farm for anti-communist right-wing groups. And he's giving speeches as Cuban freedom fighter Lorenzo Pasillo and raising money. And then grabbing as much arms as he can and hopping back in with his trailer and heading back to Dallas and New Orleans and Miami. And, you know, D.B. Cooper specifically, one of the things that I think makes Hall higher on the person of interest list is that he could pass for Latin, which the flight attendants said he had a Latin appearance.
Yeah, it certainly sounds, you know, the more you put these things together in your mind, and like I said before I saw, you know, your book, the thought never entered my mind. But then after that, the more you think about it, it's like, yeah, this dude does definitely tick off some of the boxes, the major boxes, that we know can be attributed to DB Cooper for sure. And if he was DB Cooper, we know that he lived after the jump.
Right.
The question is, how much money did he get away with? And of course, as the Loran Hall story goes, you know, we get up more towards the 80s. There's not a lot of information until that entire family basically gets arrested in a big meth making deal.
Breaking Bad. He turns into Walter White at the end of his life.
Yeah, he turns into Walter White, and I found not the trial transcripts, but the
Deposition.
Maybe the deposition or the I forget what it's called. It's definitely a legal paper outlining the charges against Loran Hall and his family.
Oh, the affidavit.
Yes. And, you know, it goes through everything, and we know that he was found guilty and this and that. And I believe served some time and died not too long after that. But, you know, aside from, you know, take DB Cooper out of it for a second, the dude lived a crazy life. And then if you add DB Cooper into the mix, holy crap, John. I mean, this,
right.
Wow.
Yeah.
But talk to me a minute about the Papises and this rifle. Let's talk about this rifle for a minute and what you gleaned from Loran Hall's family.
Yeah, and I apologize, guys. I got just getting over a cold, so thanks for putting up with me. So you probably saw an article that I saw late last year that came out in 2021, and that was by a man named Paul Tash, who's the former chairman of the Tampa Bay Times. Paul was approached by these two brothers, James and John Papis, and they said they were coming to Paul because they were concerned that there were still documents that, you know, were supposed to come out from Clinton's, you know, ruling about the release of documents in the Kennedy assassination. And then we went through the Trump administration, and documents haven't been released. And now we're still waiting for the last, whatever these batches of documents are, to come out. James is now probably 84. He was 82 at the time of the article. John's just turning 80. And they wanted to get the story out that, you know, before they pass away, they want people to know that Skip came home after the assassination and handed John this rifle. And so Skip would store large amounts of arms in these apartments that he lived at with his wife, Anne, and then John and John's girlfriend or fiance, Betty, who he's been married to now for over 60 years. They lived together at certain times, or John lived with them when Betty lived with her family or other people there. And, you know, Skip comes home after the assassination, and John had never seen that rifle before. He had actually seen Jerry Hemming's 30-06 that Hall had taken out of, you know, got back from Dick Hathcock. He saw that. He actually said, I actually put that in the back of the truck, that 30-06 that is talked about in.
Wow.
And so he actually touched that rifle. But this was, as you said, it was a sporterized 1939 Carcano. I call it Carcano. People say Mannlicher Carcano, and Mannlicher was the name of the clip that you put the 6 rounds in on the top, and then it would drop out. but the actual maker of the rifle was Carcano in Terni, Italy. And this rifle that Skip gave John is from the same armory just a year earlier. And it's also believed that the caliber is different, that the Carcano rifle that is attributed to Oswald was a 6.5 millimeter, and that the rifle that John has is a 7.35. Now, John got that from Luke Hogg, and people in the Kennedy community later kind of snickered to him because they're like, you know, if you're going to send a rifle to anyone, while Luke Hogg may be a great ballistics expert, he is all in on the single gunman theory, and he will not do anything to advance a theory that another rifle was used in the Kennedy assassination. Now, I don't know Luke Hogg, and I don't know if that's accurate or not, and so I don't want to disparage him since I don't know if that's true or not, but John is still interested in, you know, that rifle potentially being used in the Kennedy assassination. There was one other thing in that article. So Paul Tash is the former chairman of the Tampa Bay Times. He set up the Poynter Institute in St. Augustine, which is for ethics and journalism. So, you know, you're talking about a top guy in journalism that wrote this article in the Tampa Bay Times in 2021. If you do a Google search for JFK Hall, Florida, it'll come up in the top of your search, and you can actually see that article. James Papis was a sophomore at UCLA in an anthropology lecture on November 22nd, 1963. Someone came in and handed the professor a note, and the professor told the class, "I'm sorry to inform you, but President Kennedy has been shot and killed in Dallas, Texas." And James' first thought was, "Oh hell, where's Skip?" And that's where the title of my book came, because I'm asking two questions. Where was Skip on 11/23/63, and where was Skip on 11/24/1971? But John also had one more conversation with Skip about the Kennedy assassination. And he asked Skip, when Skip handed him the rifle and said, "Never talk about it again," he asked one follow-up question. He said, "What's this all about?" And Skip said, "You'll find out." And the second thing that he asked Skip was, "Well, was there another shooter?" And Skip looked at him and said, "There was a person there to flip the switch, and there was another person there to make sure the job got done." And he was not talking about Oswald. He was talking about additional to Oswald. So that's the start of the Papis thing. And the other thing is that in Loran Hall's alibi for 11/22/63, he says he starts his day waking up in California, in Monterey Park, California, and he drives his wife to work. John Papis told me he does not believe his mom was employed during that time. So we have that directly from him in 2023, making that statement to me. Hall says that he drove his wife to work, returned home. And by the way, there was never an investigation, or as far as I know, there was no documentation by the FBI or any investigator that they talked directly to Ann Papis Hall and that she corroborated that Loran took her to work that day. So there's no record of Ann Hall ever talking about this at all, ever talking about the JFK assassination at all. John Papis did say to me, if that was true, my mom would have told me that. So he said that to me directly. Hall says he then returns home, takes a shower, and is shaving with the television set on when he hears that the president has been killed, and says that he hears that somebody is saying that it was right-wing people who may have done it. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if you go back to Walter Cronkite in the Kennedy assassination, I don't think within the first hour of it being announced on television, they were talking about theories on who may have done it, but I could be wrong on that. I think they were talking about what the hell's going on at Parkland Hospital, and is the president dead, and where's his body, and what's going on. Hall says because of that, he picked up the phone and called a woman named Mildred Hyatt. And my research on Hyatt was that she was a very anti-communist person that was involved in the John Birch Society. So I think Hall used her because he must have thought in his brain that she would cover for him. But
exactly.
Later, a reporter from Long Beach, California, named Art Kevin, whose name becomes known with Hall leading up to Garrison and the HSCA, finally gets in touch with Mildred Hyatt later, not in time for this to get out to Garrison or at the HSCA. talks to Mildred Hyatt, and she goes, well, I don't know how I could have done that. I was at my sister-in-law's house that day. So if my phone rang at my house, I wouldn't have been home to take a call. So Art Kevin, I placed that in my outline of Hall's alibi. Hall then says he gets off the phone with Mildred Hyatt, gets dressed up because he's got an interview at the IPCO hospital supply company with a guy named Robert Hudson. And that he drives there. They have lunch together, and then Hudson takes him to the offices and a couple of their warehouses there. Now, remember, Hall was taking not just arms earlier in 1963. He was taking hospital supplies for the Cuban freedom fighters. And I believe he had a relationship already, and Robert Hudson was a trusted confidant for them to be able to get hospital supplies to take. Interestingly enough, that story morphs into, they talked about selling a car at lunch, which is not what Hall testifies to the HSCA. Hall says he went for the job, and then sometime 2 to 3 weeks later, he started at that company as his job. Hall crafts the belief that Mildred Hyatt and Robert Hudson are going to go to Bakersfield or are willing to testify to quash the Garrison subpoena, to say, part of what the defense would be for Hall is, why would he have to go all the way to New Orleans to testify about potentially being involved in the Kennedy assassination when he had 2 eyewitnesses right here? The problem with that is I researched the entire case of quashing that subpoena, and the judge in Bakersfield never made it a part of the case that Hall had to have corroborating witnesses. The judge in the Bakersfield subpoena case was just about whether it was legal for Garrison in New Orleans to compel a California resident to have to leave California to go to another state without enough evidence. And so not only was Mildred Hyatt never called on, later Hall says to Harold Weisberg, well, he actually testifies. This is in the book. He actually tells the HSCA, because they ask him about Mildred Hyatt, and he says, well, my attorney told me we would only need Robert Hudson anyways. So then later after this, Weisberg keeps in touch with a man who lived in the Lake Isabella area that Weisberg actually got to spy on Skip and Ann Hall when they owned the motel there. And his name was James Corky Huston, Huston, because this gets confusing with Hudson and Huston and everything. But James Corky Huston, his exchanges with Weisberg are in Weisberg's personal letters in the Internet archives that I found. And actually, when Hall is in the hospital for hepatitis, or after the subpoena is quashed, Garrison sends another letter and knows that Hall's in the hospital for hepatitis right after the subpoena. And it's this Corky that takes the letter to Ann Papis while she's alone at the house. And she's really mad because he's passing himself off as if he works for Garrison. And she believes he's been spying on him this whole time because they've been friends. So she's very upset about this Corky Huston guy. But Weisberg has a great relationship with him. He was working for Weisberg to get all this information on the Halls. And there's a letter that Corky sends to Weisberg saying, hey, why do you keep saying Hall has an airtight alibi and mentioning this guy, Robert Hudson from the IPCO or whatever the initials are, hospital supply company, because this guy is on the record recanting and saying he would never testify on behalf of Hall. So this comes out 77, 78 after Hall's already gone to Washington to the HSCA. So now you have Mildred Hyatt saying, you have John Hall saying, my mom wasn't employed at the time. Skip wasn't home in California that day, and my mom would have told me if he was. You have Mildred Hyatt saying, I was at my sister-in-law's house that morning. If you would have called me, I wasn't home. And you have the guy who supposedly had lunch with and went to visit saying, that actually didn't happen and I would never testify to that. That's pretty, I lay that out with all the documentation. You can find those letters between Corky and Harold Weisberg. And then you have Weisberg sending a message back to Corky saying, you may be right. I'm having my reporter friend look into this. My recollection is this all came from the FBI, but as we both know, the FBI could be wrong, and I certainly could be wrong. So then this guy, this reporter, Art, goes back and looks into all of it. And then we have another letter, another exchange between Weisberg and Corky. And he says, yes, my reporter friends looked into it and Hall's alibi doesn't stack up. That is in Harold Weisberg's personal letters, but back and forth between this guy. Now, you take that as, let's just say that's the Old Testament of the alibi. Now, what's the New Testament of where was he? Richard Hathcock and Roy Payne worked together on Hollywood Boulevard in this detective agency / pawn shop where Hemming and Hall had pawned that 30-06 rifle, and where Hall goes back and gets it prior to the assassination. They both swear, they are interviewed by the FBI, they have sworn affidavits, and they talk to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They both swear that they saw Loran Hall on November 18th, invited him to an event that was happening, and Hall said, I have to catch a flight to Dallas on November 18th. Hall had said the last time that he was in Dallas was the first week of November, and he never went back. So you have these two men who have no reason to lie. In fact, they have every reason to not even talk about this stuff. And they're saying that Hall told them that he had to catch a flight on November 18th to Dallas. You have Jerry Hemming swearing to the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigators, and on the record many times, saying that after the assassination, he called Lester Logue in Dallas, asked about Hall, and that Lester Logue told him that he saw Hall the day before the assassination in Dallas. That is on the record. That's not directly from Logue, but you have Jerry Hemming sworn under oath making that statement. And lastly, Roy Payne, the second of the two men that I told you talked about getting on head, that gets a call from Hall after the assassination. And Payne is upset because there was a snitch in Los Angeles that the day of the assassination called and said, hey, I know this guy had gotten a rifle from these guys. And so an FBI agent actually went to Dick Hathcock's detective agency on the 24th, the day after the assassination, looking for Roy Payne and Loran Hall.
Yes, because his fingerprints were on the rifle, no?
On the 30-06 rifle, right?
Yeah.
So what happened is Hall had that rifle with him when he was arrested with the dexedrine tablets by the Dallas police in October, and I believe that's when they fingerprinted it. I don't believe they fingerprinted a rifle after the Kennedy assassination, because how would that have been done within a 24-hour period that you're already looking for these guys? But we could talk about that. But what did happen is Hall called and Payne answered the phone, and Payne says, and this is in Payne's sworn affidavit, hey, buddy, you're in a lot of trouble. They came in looking for me. They're looking for you. And Hall says to him, I was in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel, and there's at least 100 witnesses that say I was there. Hall was saying the Hilton Hotel in Dallas. So Hall's basically admitting that he's in Dallas. He's just not saying I was at Dealey Plaza. And again, Roy Payne swears to this in an affidavit, testifies under oath to it. So take what I call the Old Testament of the alibi and what we've done to that, and now take Hathcock, should call him 3H, right, instead of triple B. Hathcock, Hemming, and Roy Payne, obviously. I don't know how anyone can conclude if the three of us were on a jury right now, just a grand jury on whether or not we should indict Loran Hall for lying to Congress about not being, in California, and then we could bring John Papis in as a witness saying, I know where I was, I know where my brother was. Loran Hall was not in California that day. He would be indicted. Whether that means he participated in the assassination, we don't know, but I believe that what I did in this book is to try to update the record, to bring all of this evidence together to prove that Loran Hall was in Dallas, Texas on 11/22/1963.
Yeah. See, John, I think when we're talking about the 30-06 rifle, I'm not so sure that he had it in October when they were in Dallas. And from what I remember with the interview with Hathcock and Payne, is that they said that Hall came to get that rifle a couple weeks before Dallas went down. So maybe like the second week in November. and that the reason the FBI was there is because Roy Payne and Loran Hall's fingerprints were found on the rifle, which implies that that rifle was found somewhere near Dealey Plaza or in Dealey Plaza, on November 22nd. If the FBI is showing up there, because I think when Loran Hall and Howard and those guys were in Dallas in October, they had taken their trailer load of guns to Lester Logue's house and left the trailer there. And I think all they got busted for was the drugs in the car at that time.
Yeah.
So,
and
that's what makes that 30-06 rifle much more interesting to me. Is that how did they find it then and show up at Roy Payne's place of employment? The day after the assassination, and then all of a sudden this rifle just disappears into the ether.
Right. Yeah, I call it. I have a chapter called "The Smoking Rifles" because we have that 30-06 and we have this new Carcano, 7.35 millimeter. I do have this in the book. This is directly from Dick Hathcock. Several months ago, since the men did not retrieve the articles, Hathcock sold the golf clubs. On September 18th, 1963, Lorenzo Hall came in with $50 and retrieved the rifle. Shortly thereafter, Hathcock received a telephone call from Jerry Patrick, who was then living in Miami, inquiring as to whether Hathcock still had the rifle. Hathcock told him that he had given the rifle to Hall for $50, and this seemed to irritate Patrick to some extent. Since then, Hathcock sent the receipt he received from Hall for the $50 to Patrick to convince him that he had not, Patrick to convince him that Hathcock had given it to Hall. And then there's some other stuff in here. So that was in September that he got the 30-06. But I believe you're correct, Rob, that John Papis said he held that rifle. So I believe that large load of weaponry that got left at Lester Logue's house, and they were somewhat lucky to the fact that they didn't get busted with all that stuff. So they left that at Logue's house and were on the way back to get it. And it was Bill Seymour, another Interpen guy, William Seymour, and Hall came back from Miami to pick up the trailer. And that's when they got arrested with the license plate falling off the back of their car and got taken to jail. They were in jail for 2 days before Lester Logue paid for an attorney there to bail them out. And Hall stayed at the YMCA. They both stayed at the YMCA. And the next day met Logue to pick the trailer up to take it back to Miami. And that is the 30-06 was supposedly in that trailer, supposedly taken to a safe house where a dentist named Dr. Crockett lived and left in the trailer. Hall's like, well, I thought he would just get it from Dr. Crockett. Hemming changes his story like 4 times on that rifle. Hemming at one point is saying, I went back to Crockett's house and that rifle was the only thing left in the trailer. Then he says, I went back to Crockett's house and it was in Crockett's house and he had given Hall $100 for it. So Hall made $50 off of that should have been mine. But Crockett just gave me the rifle because he knew it was mine. And then Jerry Hall says, yeah, then I got that rifle back and I took it sold it to a guy in Nicaragua. Is the end story from Hemming on it. Because I think Hemming, whether he and Hall hated each other or not, I don't think Hall wanted that rifle associated in any way with the Kennedy assassination. And so there's that story that Robert Grodin owns the shell from on top of the Dallas, is it the County Records building next to the courthouse? Not the Dale Tex building, not the Texas School Book Depository, but the next one next to the jailhouse. So the County Records building that there was a man working on, they were going to retar the roof of it and they're pulling the paper up and he sees something shining and there's a shell rusted on one side and it says 30-06 on it. And I think that is another very interesting story that I looked at about why is there a shell casing to a 30-06, rifle on top of the Dallas County Records building. And then, of course, John Papis with the Carcano. So what's happening now with John is that I think they were in stasis after he kind of had not given up, but the Tampa Bay Times article came out in 21. So I put on my investigative journalist hat. I'm sure you guys can understand. I'm actually, the rubber's hitting the road, and I'm actually calling somebody to talk about Skip Hall as a writer of this book, and have to tell them that I think he's DB Cooper and involved in the JFK assassination, right? Can you imagine getting that call from a Yahoo like me?
Yeah.
So I send Paul Tash a very nice email, and I send it from my office, so it has my COO title, so at least they know like I'm employed. And I call Paul, leave a message for him. He writes me a very nice email back, says, yes, I will give you a call. He calls my office, gets on the phone with me, incredibly engaging, pleasant, obviously very successful guy. He says, so what is this about? And I tell him, and he chuckles, and he says, oh yeah, Skip Hall. And then he says, can I call you back right away? And I thought that was interesting because I think he was checking on me to see if the phone number of my business was legit and all that. So about 5 minutes pass. He calls me back. We talk for about 10 minutes. I ask him if I had sent him excerpts from the book and want to say, is it okay if I use this about your article? Is there anything wrong? Is there anything inaccurate? Wanted to make sure that, I wouldn't be sued after I print the book with copyright to anybody. And he said, let me check with one of the brothers. He goes, I don't think the older one's going to want to talk to you, but I think, excuse me, but I think John will. And I said, great. And my administrative assistant comes into my office with this crazy look on her face, peeking into my window. And she says, there's a man named John Papis on the phone, and he wants to talk to you about the Kennedy assassination. And nobody at my office knew that I was writing this book. So she's thinking like a nut is calling our office. But I said, oh, what's that?
I don't know if y'all can see that. That is the 30-06 shell from Grodin's collection.
Right. They said that shell was crimped on one end where it could have acted as a sabot, and you could have put a 6.5 Carcano bullet inside of that, crimped it, and the shot out of a 30-06 rifle could have actually had, see how it's crimped on one side on the end?
Yeah.
That you could put one of Oswald's bullets in there if they'd actually fired it into a tank or into cotton. Like some people think about the magic bullet, that you could have crimped that in there. And probably one of the reasons why it either missed, or if it was a shot that went into Kennedy's back, that it wouldn't have gone in far just because of that. But yeah, so Paul Tash, John called me at my office. Our first phone conversation lasted for over an hour. He was really excited to talk to me that I was looking into this. He really had kind of never thought of Skip for DB Cooper and really wasn't interested in that. And so I realized that the relationship was going to have to be very transactional at first to build trust. And that I was going to have to let him tell me his story. And we had some great conversations. He's a very engaging, funny guy. He's a very direct guy. He would like apologize, but then say, hey, you got this wrong, you got that wrong. And I'm like, bring it on, man. I want to get everything right. So don't be afraid to give me the truth. Like I said, he's owned DC-3 airplanes, his own private aviation stuff. He's been very successful in life. And he believes that Skip was involved in the assassination. There's no question about it. He is convinced that this man who married his mom, that he lived with at the time, was involved. And he's done really well in his life, so he doesn't need to be like, this is going to be my meal ticket to try to prove this or write a book or do anything like that. He's 80 years old now. He would have done it by now. But he's very curious based on my research and what I shared with him about what Josiah Thompson came out about, the bullet found at Parkland and the whole chain of custody of the magic bullet. And we went through that because John believes if there was a way to prove that any other piece of shrapnel, any other piece of bullet fragment could be proven to not be from a 6.5 millimeter Carcano and could be proven to be from a 7.35, that it would actually be worth doing the research to find out if this rifle would match anything. And of course, that's where I kind of I support John, but I'm not a ballistics expert. I don't believe in the chain of custody of evidence in the Kennedy case. I don't believe in what happened in Bethesda with the autopsy. So for me to have any belief that the bullet fragments and bullets were handed correctly, and we hear about Paul Landis now, I'm highly skeptical of all this, but I'm willing to go along on the ride with him. And so while my book is now out, he's grateful that anybody who thinks he's nuts by bringing this up, he can give my book and say, hey, look at the chapter on his alibi and look at the chapter on where he was, and read about Skip in John's book that just came out. And now let's talk about this Carcano rifle and what Skip told me on that day, and if Skip was actually involved in assassination. So he's been talking to, we got in touch with Greg Aguilar, who's the doctor, the ophthalmologist in California who's doing that. I actually called the publisher for Josiah Thompson and got permission to use the picture of his hotel key next to the pointed bullet that he's had in 6 Seconds to Dallas and Last Second. So that's in my book, because one of the biggest differences between those two caliber rifles of a 6.5 and a 7.5 that most people don't know is that the 6.5 is a bullnose bullet that we know from looking at the magic bullet, but same armory, but the 7.5 Carcano is actually a pointed tip bullet. And so we had O.P. Wright and Daryl Tomlinson from Parkland Hospital talk about the bullet that they found having a pointed tip. And Josiah Thompson does a say what and goes back to Bardwell Odom, who's supposedly the FBI agent in Dallas, who was still alive in 1966 when Josiah Thompson not only called him on the phone, but went down there and said, there's a 1964 document, Bardwell, that says that you went back to Parkland and talked to these two gentlemen, and they confirmed that photos of CE 399, which is the magic bullet, looked like the bullet that Daryl found that rolled from under the stretcher and that he handed to O.P. Wright, and that they gave to Secret Service agent Johnston, who flew it and handed it to James Rowley. And Bardwell Odom says that never happened to Josiah Thompson. He goes, I never talked to Daryl Tomlinson or O.P. Wright about that bullet. And if I would have, I would have written a 302 because I wrote a 302 about everything. And he goes, I certainly wouldn't have written a 302 about the Kennedy assassination and anything that had to do with it. So what happened in 66 is Josiah Thompson's doing 6 Seconds to Dallas, and he flies there and he goes to meet with Tomlinson and O.P. Wright, and he brings a pointed tip bullet with him so they can reenact the scene of Tomlinson coming off the elevator and going to the stretcher and going to move it, and this bullet rolling out. So they take that bullet, they reenact the scene in the morning, and they go back to their office that they share because Tomlinson is the engineer at the hospital and O.P. Wright is the director of maintenance and security. Prior to that, in the 50s, O.P. Wright was a deputy sheriff for the Dallas Police Department Patrol Division. Guy probably knew what bullets look like. And so Josiah did this stuff with Tomlinson in the morning. They go to lunch or whatever, and they put that bullet in the desk in their office. They come back and O.P. Wright is sitting there, and Josiah starts talking to O.P. Wright about what happened that day. And they're talking about the stretcher bullet. And Josiah first pulls out the bullets from the Tippett murder scene. And we know there's questions there on was it revolver or automatic. But O.P. Wright goes, no, those aren't from the hospital. Those are 38s. So, I mean, O.P. Wright knew exactly that those were 38 caliber bullets. Josiah pulls out CE 399, the magic bullet, shows it to O.P. Wright. And O.P. Wright says, no, that's not what the bullet looked like that Daryl gave to me and that we gave. That bullet had a pointed tip. And he opens the drawer. He's like, it's like the bullet that you guys put in this morning. It had a tip like that. So my point to that is something happened that somebody in 1964 changed a document or created a document that says that Bardwell Odom went and confirmed with these two men that the bullet they found looked like CE 399. Because Bardwell Odom is saying it's not true. Daryl Tomlinson saying it's not true. And O.P. Wright are saying it's not true. And I wanted to give that to John Papis, not because I would know if a bullet was even found, why would a fired bullet be in pristine condition where you could see the pointed tip on it? But I wanted to give that to John Papis and say, look, here's what I've been able to do about Skip and his alibi. Here's just one piece of evidence where the ballistic stuff doesn't match up. And I'm not a ballistics expert. Just this story alone has two guys that worked at Parkland Hospital saying the bullet they found by the stretcher had a pointed tip. and the gun that you had, the rifle that you have, would have had a pointed tip bullet. And take it from there, my man. And that's what John is doing, and I'm helping him out. But he is willing to invest time and treasure to find out if there's any way, shape, or form, if any of those bullet fragments that are in evidence. NIST did all those high resolution studies of them, but he would like to know if there's any way that it could ever be, looking at the lands and grooves on the bullets, if anybody could ever prove that one of those bullets was a 7.35 instead of a 6.5. And again, who knows if somebody uses a sabot round and fired from the rifle he has with a 6.5, but at a minimum, he's still at 80 years of age. He wants the country to know. He doesn't consider it patriotic, and he doesn't actually even like that word, but he wants people to know the truth. And he also wants people to know that if somebody ever wants to arrest him and go to jail thinking he's an accessory for holding this rifle all this time, he's like, yeah, he doesn't really care about that. But he goes, I just want the truth to be out. After all these years, was Skip involved? Because Skip sure as hell made it seem to him like he was. And he knows Skip wasn't truthful about his alibi. And he knows he's had this gun for 57 years. And like you said, Triple B, you almost went out to Oregon to look at it. And I'm probably going to be looking at it in November at CooperCon.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff, John. I got one last thing for you that could possibly help tie Skip to the DB Cooper thing. A listener of mine sent me, and I don't know if it's accurate, but you would definitely know, Skip Hall's obituary.
Yes, I have that. Yeah, it's in the book.
Okay. It says something in there.
Right.
Well, I'll let you explain it.
So
I think you know where I'm going.
So, we have the Breaking Bad and everything, and he's supposed to be. There's newspaper articles in 1990 about his 3 adult kids being sentenced and for prison. There is no newspaper articles about him being sentenced. He was facing 20 years in prison and $1 million fine. My friend Ryan Burns, the criminal defense attorney who does the channel DB Cooper Sleuth that I was on, talking more about, if you want to hear more about the Cooper case and Skip, we recorded that on Tuesday on the DB Sleuth channel. But he sent me something that he could get through his criminal system access that Skip may have served 18 months. John Papis laughed when I told him that and said, my brother and Paul Tash and I looked into it, and we don't know if Skip actually ever served time or not. In the articles that came out about Skip, and I know Triple B, you found the affidavit and some other stuff, there were actual articles that said CIA agent captured and being extradited back. And in that article, and I outlined it in the book, the reporter called the CIA for a response, and the CIA responded, we can neither confirm or deny if anyone is ever involved in the CIA, because we can't do that. And the CIA does not condone any illegal activity. So Skip is 60 at the time, and Skip passes away at the age of 65. In April of 65, he passes away, and there's a small little paragraph in the Wichita Eagle. It says Loran Eugene Hall Sr. and is followed by Boeing Wichita Superintendent. And of course, my head exploded when I saw that, because a Boeing 727. Now, I think, to be candid, I believe that was either a gift or CIA, or he had friends in the Wichita area that set him up with a gig towards the end of his life. I don't believe he worked for Boeing prior to 71. However, I mean, his wife worked for Cessna. They both had pilot's license. He was in Interpen flying around talking to. There's 2 recordings of Loran on YouTube that are split from the same speech. If you do a search for Loran Hall John Birch Society, and he says, I am a Cuban freedom fighter. And he talks in what the voice of the DB Cooper supposedly had, a low voice with no accent. But he talks in that recording about talking to pilots about plane pressurization, climate control for his guys to jump from air is basically what he says, or deploy from air. So whether Skip was DB Cooper or not and worked for Boeing before, I think if he worked for Boeing, he might not have gone to see Lyle Cameron and ask how you jump out of a 727. The guy who the whole Lyle Cameron thing with Jack Ruby is just nuts to me. But yes, to end it all, he passed away at age 65, and supposedly was retired Boeing Wichita superintendent.
Crazy stuff. Well, John, man, we appreciate you stopping by. It's been one of the most fun episodes in recent memory for me.
Oh man, thank you guys.
Yes. Thank you. And I am looking forward to ordering this book just as a DB Cooper and Loran Hall fan or just they have major interest and an aspect of mystery to me. And Loran Hall to me would have definitely been the type of personality to do something crazy like that. And I think everything you said was fascinating, and I really appreciate you coming on and spending over 2 hours with us.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Joe. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for the invitation. Sorry if I got a little long-winded anywhere, but it's 267 pages with 80 images, so there's no way we were even going to be able to cover it in 2 hours, but I appreciate the opportunity. And again, the work with John Papis goes on. So if there's ballistics people in this community that want to get in touch with you, Rob, to get in touch with me or whatever, I mean, John is still sending emails out to people just a couple this last week saying, how do we get access to fragments? How do we do certain testing? So he's still all in on this to figure out if that rifle was involved.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, we'll stay in touch, John. I'm sure the story will evolve as time goes on. And to pick up John's book, the link is in the description. So if you're interested, feel free to grab it. Once again, thank you, John Limbach, for stopping by the show.
Thanks, guys.
Amazing conversation, and we appreciate it so much.
Yeah.
Hang around for us, John, 1 second, and we'll wrap this bad boy up. So for Joe Scarsborelli and the Triple B and John Limbach, thank you for watching the episode. Until next time, folks, peace.